Okay.
Okay, we're not missing anyone.
All right, in the interest of time, it's 6:03, so we're going to get started here pretty quickly. If there's an empty chair next to you, if you could raise your hand. And if you are looking for a seat, go sit right next to that guy. And James is bringing out some extra chairs, so hopefully we can get everyone settled. There is also a sign-in sheet at the back of the room. So if anybody didn't sign in, please take a minute to do that at least before you leave. And it is where you need to sign up if you want to give public comment, which is at the beginning of the agenda. So if you want to do that, make your way back there now and sign up to give public comment. Just going to give people maybe one more minute to get settled. Okay, well, welcome to the 6th Portland Clean Energy Fund Grant Committee meeting. I'm not sure at what point we'll stop noting what number it is, but not yet. We're going to start the meeting with an opening inspiration, and Megan Horst, who is a PCEF committee member, has volunteered to do that for us today. Don't forget to push your button.
Oh, like that. Okay. Hi, everyone. I have chosen to start, I guess, inspiration with a more traditional land acknowledgement because it relates a lot to the topics we're going to be talking about tonight. So, in the spirit of the day's focus on food systems, the first part, many food systems gatherings, I see lots of food systems workers, activists, advocates in the room. Many food systems gatherings are starting with land acknowledgements, meaning some statement about the long history of the place and the indigenous peoples who have lived in the place, and connecting to how our collective actions can contribute to some kind of reckoning of the wrongs of history and to hopefully more holistic visions of sustainable food systems and greater justice going forward. So in the food systems world in particular, land acknowledgements can help non-Indigenous people think about food systems more expansively and think about food justice work in the context of the harms of colonialism and acknowledging the limits of kind of the Jeffersonian image of farming that is fairly pervasive in U.S. Food systems work. So I just want to start by acknowledging the people whose land we're standing on today, and I'm going to focus mainly on the Kalapuyan people and read some words from David Lewis, who is a tribal historian of the Grand Ronde and has a PhD in anthropology from University of Oregon, and I had the pleasure to meet at the Oregon Community Food Systems Network convening last year. So some folks in the room probably heard him speak and gave some history, so I'm reading verbatim from his great website, just to bring a little history in the room. So the Kalapuyans originally occupied over 1 million acres in the Willamette and Umpqua valleys. They have lived here for over 14,000 years and have endured enormous changes to their traditional lifeways during the past 200 years. The Kalapuyan peoples created the amazing fecundity of the Willamette Valley by practicing a form of land management or horticulture where they annually set fire to the valley and in so doing cleared the land of excess vegetation, renewed food plants, and deposited nutrients in the soil as well as other benefits. They were a stable society who harvested the fruits and vegetables of the valley and hunted and fished the terrestrial and aquatic animals to provide their primary food sources. The Kalapuyan occupied the majority of the Willamette Valley with villages scattered along the rivers and streams of the valley. They had a seasonal lifeway where the tribes would harvest vegetables, hunt and fish at specific times of the year throughout a wide expanse of the valley and into the foothills and mountains bordering the valley. Well, through a series of plagues and forced treaties and a lot of history, by 1850, their populations declined sharply from an estimate of over 20,000 people to just about 1,000 people. In 1851, the tribes of the Willamette Valley signed or were forced to sign treaties which allowed for the creation of permanent reservations within their homelands, but these treaties were ultimately not ratified by Congress, meaning they did not get a reservation. By March 1856, all the Kalapuyans had been moved to the Grand Ronde Indian reservations, where they then integrated with other tribes and have become an important part of the genealogical heritage of the Grand Ronde tribe. So today, the majority of Kalapuyan people are members of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. But some Kalapuyan descendants people live in Portland, which is also home to the 9th largest urban Native American population in the country and includes indigenous people from this region, but as well as from all over the country, North and Latin America, and indigenous folks from all over the world. So I bring this up as our kind of opening inspiration to honor their stories and remember that many of us are actually uninvited guests on this land, and that to hopefully bring a little bit of this history into our conversation today about how Indigenous justice is part of our work on climate action and sustainable food systems. So, thank you.
Thank you, Megan. So this is the part of the meeting where we usually do introductions, and there are a lot of folks in the audience. So we're going to start with grant committee member introductions and then move to staff at the table. And then I would just ask that everyone kind of give your name, and if you have an affiliation that you want to note that affiliation, but then keep moving the microphone back to the back of the room. So we'll start with committee member introductions. Megan.
Hi, I'm Megan again, Megan Horst.
Shanice Clark.
There we go.
Rainfeast Juntinio Viatoro.
Jeffrey Moreland.
Robin Wang.
Maria Sippen. Good evening, Faith Graham.
Michael Eden Hill.
And Andrea Hamburg is excused from today's meeting. I'm Katie Lister, PCEF staff.
I'm Sam Barrasso, PCEF staff.
Hi, I'm James Valdez, PCEF staff.
Janet Hammer, PCEF staff.
Max Showers, not PCEF staff.
Melanie Rios, Cascade Biochar.
Pat Lando, the nonprofit Recode.
Taryn Evans with the Coalition of Communities of Color.
June Reyes, PCEF staff.
Forrest Zachary, Solar Sales and Development.
Katie Johncock, Craft 3.
Chris Dubroto, Village Gardens.
Colleen Dixon, Zinger Farm.
Ruben Fonseca, Portland OIC, and Rosemary Anderson High School.
Kyla Yeoman, just myself.
Jeff Strang, Portland NAACP.
Gina Dake, Portland Parks Urban Forestry.
Ryan Shanahan, Earth Advantage.
Jen Latu, Portland General Electric.
Deidre Sheets, and I'm with Nutrition Garden RX. It's emerging.
Jen Cairo, Portland Urban Forestry.
Lisa Hubbard, SEIU Local 49, the Janitors Union.
Mo Taylor with VOS Workers' Rights Education Project.
Osmani Alcaraz Ochoa, VOS Workers' Rights Education Project.
Brian Stewart, Quiet Clean PDX.
Michael Heumann with Metropolitan Alliance for Common Good.
Jenny Hall with Energy Trust of Oregon.
Jen Morse, Portland State University.
Suzanne Easton, East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District.
Angela Prividelli, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability.
Jay Richmond, Oregon Tradeswoman.
Rob Cato, Zinger Farm.
Weston Glass, Guerrilla Development.
I'm Jason Skipton with Growing Gardens.
Shantae Johnson, Mudbone Grown Farm.
Arthur Shavers, Mudbone.
Eddie Hill, Black Food Sovereignty Coalition, Oregon State University's Soils and Crops.
Joe McFerrin, Portland OIC.
And there are a few more chairs here if people want to sit down.
Chris Robertson, Cascade Resilience.
Leah Wilson, resident. Heather Morrill, Portland Farmers Market.
Katie Myers, OHSU Food Systems and Society Program.
Micah Meskel, Portland Audubon.
Serbi Mahajin, Friends of Trees.
Lindsay Hageman, Cascade Biochar.
Susie Peterson, Columbia Land Trust and Backyard Habitat.
Jennifer Carbs, Portland Environmental Services.
Rachel Steinke, also Columbia Land Trust and Backyard Habitat Program.
Michelle Welton, Grow Portland.
Cassandra Profita, Oregon Public Broadcasting.
Nicole Cousino, Nature Commode Nutrient Cycling.
Eric Gonzalez, Cascade Biochar.
And we're very grateful for our folks at Open Signal. You don't get off the hook.
David Kesters, Open Signal.
Michael Adegueo, Open Signal.
All right, thank you all. Great to have you here.
Thank you. And is there anyone on the phone who would like to introduce themselves? I'm not sure there's a methodology that works best for this, so whoever wants to speak first and introduce themselves, go for it.
This is Matt Gordon with Rogue Farm Corps, and I'm also with my wife here.
And I'm Katie Holker with Families for a Livable Climate.
Anyone else? All right, thank you. Sam wanted to give an acknowledgement of the space that we're in.
So I appreciate seeing all the beautiful faces in here. I just want to acknowledge the space in here. This is one of Oregon's first net zero buildings, and it was developed and it is led and it is managed by the Junkie Delta as a historically black women's fraternity, sorority, apologies. And just want to acknowledge we've had several events in the space, and it's always a welcoming space. And I want to thank Keisha Light for opening up the space. And there's a long history that went into developing the space, and I think it's important for folks to know that. And we'll have that happen another time. But thank you for the space to the Junkie Deltas.
Okay, I'm gonna ask committee members, kind of call the meeting to order a little bit and ask committee members if there's a proposal to approve the minutes or if there are any amendments that need to be made to the minutes. It's gotta be one of those two things.
I propose that we accept the minutes as published.
Second.
All right. Any objections? All right. Seeing none, we will approve the meeting minutes from 12/16/19 and move into public comment. June, can you check if there is any new any new folks who signed up for public comment? And we will go to the phone after we look to see if there is anyone in the room who wants to give public comment. So there's no one in the room who wants to give public comment. Is there anyone on the phone? Okay, well, we were running a little bit behind, but now we have just made up a few minutes. We're back on schedule. So our first presenter is one of our committee members, Dr. Megan Horst, and she's going to be providing the framework, kind of the introduction and framework for the regenerative agriculture section. After her presentation, we're going to be asking some folks who have been invited to sit on a panel who will have a little bit of dialogue with the community, with the committee members, and with Megan about kind of their perspective on regenerative agriculture within the Portland area. So.
Oh, yeah. So sorry, you're hearing from me a couple times tonight, but this is, you know, the topic I'm really excited about. So you'll hear from me a lot, but I am only speaking for 15 minutes or so and then bringing panelists up. So the goal of me speaking for the next 15 minutes is just to kind of provide some introductory starting place so that we're all in the same spot when we're using language, and just to provide a little overview of food systems and how it might fit into PCEF. So that's the goal. Oops, and sorry, I'm using my, oh, I went the wrong way. There we go. So starting with the term food system, I have two images up there, nice and large on the screen. Sorry, I want to show my speaker notes here on my phone. So the word food system shows up in our PCEF guiding language and in our grant, it will show up in the grant application language. So I thought it was important to start with that phrase. On the left, we see kind of an image that's from the American Planning Association and the United States Department of Agriculture. And that's kind of a really basic image when it comes to sustainable food systems world. What we're talking about in that world is a closed kind of loop, a circular loop of sustainable, starting with kind of sustainable local food production through processing and consuming to recovery. And the whole idea of it being a circle is that there's no waste, right? So I show that image just to show how kind of the food system encompasses that wide range of activities. And on the right, I included kind of, I guess, following up on the acknowledgement I talked about, but an image of a food system from an indigenous perspective. And this is from the North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems Organization. And I kind of included it just to show another perspective on food systems. And this one includes 4 universal foundations. So they're on the left there. 1, the removal of colonized thought. 2, reconnect spiritually, mentally, and physically with the natural world. 3, understand and build indigenous foundations. And 4, retain, share, and practice knowledge. And then there's this also includes this system includes a range of activities, including farming, but also including wild food gathering and harvesting. There's a focus on the right on large animals and on smaller animals, ocean life, fishing, hunting, trapping, butchering, etc. The top element is talking about indigenous wisdom, and the bottom one includes elements like fire, cooking rocks, and etc. So I include all this kind of to follow up on my earlier discussion and just make sure we're thinking of food systems in multiple and diverse ways. But now I show you what the actual dominant industrial food system that we know that dominates, I guess, the US landscape. This is really more what it looks like, not like the more idealized value-based visions I just showed on the last slide. So I know the text may be a little hard to read, but it shows that cycle, and this is clearly not a loop cycle because kind of the point is that in the industrial food system, the loop is broken, and there is a lot of waste, and it doesn't kind of circle back. But this one starts on the left also with growing and goes through kind of the acts of harvesting, transporting, et cetera, through disposing. And in the blue columns in that small font, it points out a lot of the negative environmental impacts associated with a lot of the different parts of the food system. So for example, under the growing one, it mentions using heavy equipment and maintaining crops on farms that are big kind of monocultures. And on the last one, disposing, there's mention of the people discarding leftover food and packaging, and while most of that is recyclable or compostable, the reality is that most of it ends up in landfills, and that is also true in Portland. So this is when we talk about food systems, this is the one we're trying to change, but it's the dominant reality. And now I just want to talk a little bit about carbon emissions in the food system. We'll take a global view first. So food, why it's in the PCEF language is because it's an important part of global carbon emissions and down to Portland, and I'll get to Portland in a minute. But there's lots of different studies out there. Scientists debate the exact amount, but some food probably accounts for somewhere between 20 to 35% of total emissions, kind of depending how you count it and the methods used. And what you include in the food system versus put, for example, on the transportation sector when you're transporting food items. So this chart is one of many possible images that could be used, but it points out land use change. So for example, the cutting down of forests to put in soybean plantations, for example. And the actual act of farming account for 15 to 25% globally. And the other 5 to 10% come from all the other activities of the food system. So kind of a main takeaway is that land use change and the act of producing food are the most important when it comes to kind of the carbon emissions of food system globally. But let's look at US emissions. Again, there are lots of different researchers out there, so different charts might have some variability, but they'll show kind of the same larger story. And this one again shows that the majority of US food system emissions, so this is again food systems one, comes from the production part of food, so how it's produced or grown. And then just a smaller amount of it comes from transport, wholesale, and retail. So again, this kind of underscores that from a carbon emissions perspective, an important place to focus is the production side, although not to say there aren't other reasons to focus on other parts. And this chart is just showing kind of breaking down where these emissions come from a little bit. This is showing how global methane, and so back to a global chart here, global methane and nitrous oxide emissions have been rising steadily since the 1960s. So these are potent greenhouse gases, mainly due to an ongoing push towards more industrialized forms of agriculture globally. Sorry, I'm whipping through a lot of charts here, but I'm hoping the main story sticks, even if the kind of details are lost. But okay, so the next one, this one's just pointing out, now this one's a little controversial, I guess, and I want to make sure I say things and not leave just the image of the bar chart here. But one thing to note about food, and I think this is well known, I guess, in popular media these days, is not all foods are equal in terms of their quote-unquote carbon footprint. So this chart shows that in terms of pounds of carbon emissions per serving, meat and dairy tend to be far more carbon intensive than like beans, grains, vegetables, and fruits. That's why when you do those like carbon emissions calculators, it'll ask you how much meat you eat and tell you to eat less meat usually. And so that's super important. And I think especially when we reflect on the industrialized food system, that's what this chart is showing, is that kind of industrialized meat does have a really heavy, and industrialized dairy have pretty heavy carbon footprints, and beef is the standout here above other forms of meat. But I also do want to note out is that this data all is based on what the kind of dominant industrial food systems. And there's also lots of researchers and practice showing that ranchers and farmers can produce meat and dairy in ways that are really great for the environment and great from a carbon perspective. In fact, there's research to show that grazing could actually be an important way to regenerate carbon or capture carbon and sequester it. So it's a very nuanced picture. So simply saying no more meat is not a full story. It might be reducing industrial meat from anonymous sources. It's probably a good move, but supporting positive forms of animal agriculture can be part of good carbon practices. So there's a lot more to say on it, but I'll leave it at kind of a basic there. I know this is full of, but also I just want to point out that trying to account for carbon in the food system is really complicated. It's much more complicated, I think, than in the energy sector. When we hear, oh, if we do all this insulation and upgrade some windows, we can measure the house went from that much energy use down to that little, and that's pretty easy to measure, and that's great. Food is much more complicated, in part because our food system in the US is not particularly transparent. A lot of it, local growers, a lot of people buy from local growers because of increased transparency. But this is just showing the University of Michigan scholars have tried to do like a robust life cycle assessment of all kinds of different food items. I just put the ones for pork and coffee up there. And they try to account for where carbon emissions are coming from from production through packaging, refrigeration, people's preparation at home, through the roasting of coffee and different types, and it's complicated. So anything that can be said about food has to be said with nuance that it's really hard to make big statements about carbon emissions because one coffee bean may be roasted really differently than another. So generalizations are really difficult. So even though I made some earlier, I'm now kind of backing away and saying they're difficult. So it's just something to be aware of as we kind of move into thinking about reducing carbon emissions in the local food system. But let's move to Portland. This chart should look familiar because it's from one of our previous guest speakers. I think that was Kyle from the Portland Climate Action Plan. So this is a chart he presented that night. And if you recall, he pointed out that Portland's moving to kind of a two-part carbon emissions inventorying practice, where there's both kind of the carbon that's produced through industrial practices and transportation and et cetera in Portland. And then the other side is the consumption base. So what we all as residents living here, what we consume and how that affects carbon emissions. And that chart shows the top sources of consumer-based emissions, consumption-based, and food and beverages is the second largest one, just below vehicles and actually above appliances. And the bar chart color orange is referring to the way Portland accounts for it, that most of that carbon is, again, from the production part of food and only a little bit from pre-purchase transportation, wholesale retailers use, so cooking and et cetera, and then the moving the waste component, so transporting the waste. So pretty similar to what we saw global and nationally also. So, and I'm moving through this quickly. And I already kind of brought up some of these issues earlier, but I also wanted to take a couple moments to talk about kind of inequities in the food system. So to move away from carbon for a second, I already kind of read a land acknowledgement about Kalapuyan people and the relationship between the white settlement of the land for farming and the exclusion and dispossession of Native folks from land. And so this is pointing out that in terms of injustices, that's a pretty major one to think about in the food system, is that our kind of local, our current food system was founded on a series of pretty significant inequities. The map on the left shows historical Native territories at 1841, and the map on the bottom left shows reservations as of 1880, and those sizes have actually decreased because reservation land has been taken away, but only a fraction left. And on the right actually is a snapshot of the black exclusion laws that were in place in the 1850s, again, when settlers were coming over via the Oregon Trail. Not only were Native Americans getting dispossessed of land, but black folks were not allowed to reside, settle, or own land in Oregon for about 20 to 30 years when most of the land was given away. So when we think of, and that was when most of today's most of the farms, homesteads were established. So those are pretty predominant injustices upon which kind of Oregon's food system is founded. So that's just, could say a lot more, but for brevity's sake, I'll just mention one other major food system inequity that probably everybody in the room is pretty aware of, and that's hunger. You know, a startling number of Portlanders are hungry every day. This is from the Portland Monthly, and it's a little dated now, but the numbers are probably around 16% of Oregon households are suffering from food insecurity. And there's some numbers up there about the percentage of school children who are hungry, who qualify for free and reduced lunches in the schools. So that's an indicator of federal poverty level. And that's nearly 40% of kids in Portland public schools qualify for free and reduced lunch. And in the top right of that little cafeteria tray shows that SNAP recipients, if people are eligible for SNAP, which undocumented immigrants, there's not always, they're not eligible, but anyway, that SNAP dollars don't go very far. One cannot sustain a good family eating, cannot sustain good food for a family on SNAP dollars alone, when SNAP is foods, like the word for food stamps these days. So there's lots of other injustices in the food system. I just bring up two that may be relevant to PCEF. And so just a couple more comments. This is from our PCEF code language. It should look familiar to everyone in the room probably, and to us on the advisory committee, but I want to bring to what we're going to be working on PCEF. So the language says that 10 to 15% of our grant funding should go to regenerative agriculture and green infrastructure. So I'm only talking about the first one right now, regenerative agriculture. Green infrastructure is sort of another bucket that result in the sequestration of greenhouse gases. And kind of the language goes on there. But what I want to call to attention is the phrase regenerative agriculture that results in the sequestration of greenhouse gases, and just make sure everybody on our committee has a somewhat common understanding of what regenerative agriculture is. So here's a slide I borrowed from the National, I forget what the NRDC stands for, but National Resources. Thank you. And so there's lots of practices associated with regenerative agriculture. The key idea is that regenerative agriculture increases the capacity of the soil to store carbon. So I have a little bit of data coming up about what the capacity might be. But common practices associated with regenerative agriculture are listed up there: cover cropping, no-till, organic annual cropping, compost tea, holistically managed grazing, biochar, and terra preta, which is like a type of biochar in the Amazon. Animal integration, so kind of pointing out animals can play a positive role here. Ecological aquaculture. Agroforestry, I'll just point out in urban context, some people call that permaculture or perennial gardens or food forests. There's kind of lots of different phrases and types, but kind of tree-based food systems, or incorporating trees in permanent, perennial, bushes, berries, etc., perennial crops, and silvopasture. So we could probably go into great detail, but knowing that there are a range of kind of accepted practices. And a few comments on the carbon impacts before we bring our guests up. So, one thing that's pretty cool about agriculture is it's unique both in the ability where we can actually reduce emissions through better practices than the kind of industrial system, and capture them in the soil through carbon sequestration. So there's kind of like a two-pronged approach that can happen with agriculture. And there's, again, scientists have lots of different numbers out there, but what I could find is that there's estimates that they could offset global emissions by 10 to 15%. So that's not 100%. It's not going to be the silver bullet or anything, but it's an important part of the equation for climate action. And measuring carbon in the soil is a evolving science, and there are, to my knowledge, I'm no soil scientist. I know there's at least one in the room. Anyway, there are some evolving kind of standard practices for doing that. As I mentioned, it's harder than measuring changes in energy use. There are kind of standards emerging at global and national that can be used. Many local urban growers in the Portland area might not be currently doing this. It may not have the technical expertise necessarily right now to quantify in scientific ways their impacts, but it is possible. It may be possible to develop training and monitoring programs to help local practitioners if that's something PCEF wanted to do. And I'll just say a little bit about the Portland's food system. There's so much to say about it, but just some overview stuff. Nearly $5 billion is spent annually on food in the region by us buying food. And only 1.5% of that is spent on locally sourced food. At least this is what was found by a colleague of mine at Portland State at the Institute for Metropolitan Studies on the left there. So potential for huge shifts. I've heard numbers of up to 4 to 5%. But either way, we know it's well below 100%. On the right is a map of farms. It's not probably a comprehensive map. Apologies to farmers in the room if you're not up there, but it's a map of CSA serving and farmers market serving farms in the Portland metro region. So the blue and red dots show farms and where they're located. So kind of a point that many farms serve Portland, even though they're not located within the boundaries. And here's a few. This also is not a comprehensive list. Also, apologies if you're not up there. It's not meant to. Please don't refer to this as a comprehensive map but I just included a few examples of urban agriculture organizations that exist in Portland to just demonstrate that there's a diversity of actors, of organization types, of forms, of scales, of locations, of practices, of markets, of audiences. They operate on city-owned, on private land, on church land, on donated, on school, squatted land. There are large farms to community gardens, to permaculture, food forest, to school and institutional gardens, to rooftops. Some are for-profit, most are not. Some are nonprofit, some are very community-focused, some are entrepreneurial, some are individual and family-focused. So these are just an example to show kind of the diversity of actors. And I was asked to comment a little on what does the city of Portland do on the food system. Here's some history. I won't go into the great detail. Portland does have a little role. But that said, currently Portland's main role is just to enable urban agriculture to happen and get out of the way and reduce regulations. And they went through a major effort to do that. There's not a whole lot of proactive resources being sent into the food system right now from the city. We can say more about that, but that's probably enough for now to leave time for our panel. This is where food is mentioned in the Climate Action Plan. We can refer to that later if wanted, but the Climate Action Plan acknowledges that food plays a major role. And I want to conclude, or open up, I guess, the conversation just by my attempt to summarize some challenges and barriers, thinking about urban agriculture, and particularly in PCEF's language on carbon sequestration and regenerative agriculture. But I think our panel can illuminate more on these challenges and barriers. But the challenges, one is the dominance of the industrial food system. It's a hard nut to crack. Land is expensive. There's a loss of land in the city as more is getting turned into development for housing. And that's a good thing from an urban planning perspective. But there's competition for land. A lack of significant and reliable market demand for food producers. Low profits on food. It's really hard to pay workers well. So the high hopes of green jobs pathway, it's been challenging, I think, for urban agriculturalists to realize that as a really sustainable pathway for themselves. There's limited grant funds and high competition for those limited funds. There's competition from greenwashing businesses and tech. This is really a big deal in New York now, kind of rooftop, high-tech, precision, urban agriculture, I think it's called, which may be being practiced, maybe have strong environmental practices, but not all the same social values associated with it. Maybe there's a lack of technical expertise on the carbon implications of practices. I'm fairly convinced that most urban growers are already doing many great things, but they may not be able to quantify that and prove it in any sort of scientific way. And then there's lots of historical and ongoing inequities and who has benefited and burdened, even in the sustainable food systems movement. So possibilities, well, that's for us to brainstorm and people to bring ideas for, but maybe there's possibilities of more secure land tenure, more reliable market demand for growers, so through institutional purchasing, more consumer demands and incentives or price and income supports. Maybe more reliable funding, capacity building around carbon, and bringing a strong justice lens. So I think I want to just call our speakers up. So could I call our speakers up? I think you know who you are. So we have folks here from Zenger Farm. Well, come on up, yeah. See them all coming up.
Colleen and Rob from Zenger Farm, and Shantae from Mudbone Grown, and Jason from Growing Gardens.
And where do you want them to sit, Katie?
So there are 3 chairs right here. Just
It's okay, I think Shantae and
and then there's 1 chair over here. There's just also this really this cord, so don't trip on it.
Katie, I forgot what prompt you gave them all. I didn't write that down. You gave them all prompt to start, right? Just introduce themselves. Do you want to kick them off? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't have to. Okay, so once everyone is seated, we're going to ask our panelists we asked each of our kind of organizations who are represented up here to give just a 5-minute, very brief kind of, this is who we are. The committee members did get links to their websites and a 1-pager, so they should be a little bit familiar with their organizations, and if not, can do homework after the fact. And also just kind of, what are the highest priority things you think this committee needs to know as grant makers and funders in this space that you all are kind of experts in the Portland area? So I guess I would ask you to first introduce yourself, and then give that 5 minutes. We'll go through all of the panelists, and then Megan has some specific questions to get the conversation started, and then we'll also ask for questions from the committee. So maybe we can start down here with Jason.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jason Skipton. I'm with Growing Gardens. Is that just an introduction now? Mm-hmm. And then the organization?
Yep.
Okay, great. Glad I was listening. First of all, thank you guys so much for having us here. This is a true honor for our organization. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the inner kind of working parts to Growing Gardens that maybe a lot of folks don't know about. So we've been working here in the city for a little over 25 years, really focusing in 3 main areas. Home gardens is really the roots to our organization. It's really, the idea was then how to reduce as many barriers to food access as possible. And the idea was to then get gardens built in the backyards of low-income families. I'll talk a little bit just briefly about how that's evolved and emerged over the last 25 years. Really with the idea around 5 years ago, we decentralized our office, started hiring program graduates of our organization to then be working in their own neighborhoods and leading in their own neighborhoods, really thinking about the idea of food citizens, as Professor Horst has talked about. That's really changed our office and our organization and the impact of our work that's happening across the city. So then having organizers across the metro area then leading in their own neighborhoods and then telling the organization, Growing Gardens, what work needs to be done in their own neighborhoods. We also work in 10 elementary schools doing garden-based education and connecting students into STEM and STEAM education, but also getting kids outside and getting engaged in the garden, and then eating healthy food as well. And then our last program is called Let Us Grow, where we're working in 16 correctional facilities across the state of Oregon, doing 9 months of horticulture education and production. So last year did about 400,000 pounds of produce that went back into prison meals. So I think a lot of times we get dubbed a gardening organization, which, you know, our name says Growing Gardens. But really our work starts at a garden, right? It's really about building communities. It's really about connecting with folks and leaders in their own neighborhoods. It's about providing access to high quality food, but also practical and hands-on education, really with the idea to then build and foster positive social networks and community. For the organization, it's really about building that lifelong relationship and lifelong food producers within our city and state. We work for a minimum with home gardens families for 3 years. So anyone who enrolls into our program will get 3 years of support or mentorship from our organization. And that's really kind of the start. It's a longer process after that. I'd say we have some nationally recognized program and work that's being done where folks are coming from around the country to take our school garden coordinator certificate training, 35 hours of training to then start a school garden wherever you're living. In the world, we had folks come from Canada and Singapore a couple years ago. Yeah, so one of the things that we were asked to talk about is how can PCEF make grant investments in regenerative agriculture that are a meaningful impact around carbon reduction, climate resiliency, and equitable community benefit. Some of the things I really put down were really around supporting the work that we're doing that's happening right now on the ground. That investing in the work that's being done in these amazing organizations and colleagues that I have here. I'd say that, I'm going to speak collectively for a second, but that we're creative and innovative and bold with what we're doing within our sector. And so I really hold these folks in high esteem and the work that's being done in our community. I'd say to look at supporting the work that's being done and supporting people, right, and staff, and that job creation and that job development, and not items. So more staffing and less shovels. That as an organization, we're doing job development and job creation through school garden educators and coordinators and community organizers. That support from PCEF is very meaningful and impactful. And imagine if these folks had that base funding to then be more creative and be more bold with the work that's being done. I don't know if I'm at time, but I think I'll probably stop there.
You're just out of time, but thank you. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
I'm Rob Cato, co-executive director of Zenger Farm. Colleen's going to talk about our work.
I'm Colleen Dixon, co-executive director at Zenger Farm. So Zenger Farm was established in 1999. We're 20 years old, and we have 24 acres of farmland, organic farmland and wetland, as well as an urban grange building in East Portland. We provide a lot of hands-on learning opportunities for families, youth, and adults. We kind of focus on social justice, food access, and education as the center of our nonprofit, believing that basic nourishment is also a human right, and that without addressing the root causes of systemic inequality in the food systems, that we can't move forward. So our work is also, Jason, you really went for it. I'm like, now I feel like I have to do a long thing, but our work is broken up into a few categories. We have a farm, a working organic farm, that we grow and sell food from for the community. We have a CSA program. We were the first CSA in the state to offer CSA boxes in exchange for SNAP benefits and be SNAP eligible CSA. And that led to statewide programs to allow that for various CSA programs. We also run youth education programs. So we run farm school for all fifth graders in the David Douglas School District. So all fifth graders come out to the farm 3 times a year and do science-based education and STEM learning about their own food systems, their own neighborhood, how to grow food, where food's coming from, also science related to that, and environmental justice work. And then we also do community-based food education and cultural cooking, sharing workshops. I think I don't know, like to repeat what you said, I think I see the opportunity here. Well, one is that Portland is already like a very foodie focused town. So I feel like there's a lot of awareness about food and local food and food systems. And I think the opportunity here is to leverage that interest and knowledge that's already there and connect it to stronger equity work and to get more funding into work that really focuses both those kind of social justice aspects of food systems and can kind of capitalize on that food interest and food excitement to leverage food access and climate resiliency. And I think, Rob and I were talking about that before we came here too, like even thinking about this region nationally in terms of climate change becoming one of the, hopefully not, but could be one of the last places where there's an environment where farming is possible, and really thinking of the Northwest as an area for food production as climate changes. And then also echoing what Jason was saying, I think, really we see the opportunity as recognizing the work that's already being done and how to invest in it and really fund what's already there. And I think it also helps us, I think your slide really nailed the challenges and the opportunities, but I think one of the challenges is we're responsive to our communities, doing the work on the ground, and it's really hard to kind of look up and work with each other. And I think, we do get to see each other, we do work with each other, but knowing that kind of those basic community needs are met, I think would allow us to just vision and collaborate in a really amazing way, would give us space and room to do that. So that to me feels like a really exciting opportunity coming out of this. I don't know if I used my 5 minutes, but I don't know.
No, you did. You had 30 more seconds, but that was great. Thank you very much. Shantae, you can have her 30 seconds.
Okay,
Yeah.
30 seconds. Okay, great.
Gift from me to you.
Oh, thank you. Shantae Johnson with Mudbone Grown here. And we are a Black-owned small farm business that's growing mixed vegetables, herbs, berries, and vegetable starts for direct markets and institutional markets. We also work on land acquisition and food system consultation. For the past 5 years, our experience has been working on multiple different farm sites. And so far we've created probably about 3 agricultural training programs that focus on Black, Indigenous, and POC and veteran populations. And so we do kind of a lot of different things. Similar to a lot of these folks on the stage, we kind of have so many different touch points. And we work with schools for farm field trips and are involved in supporting many different Black-led organizations such as Black Food Sovereignty Coalition, We Grow, Beyond Black, and many others. So we really try to collaborate and support different grassroots efforts that are already happening in community. I'd like to just point out that, one of the reasons why Arthur and I got involved in this work is because our grandmothers have really been our muse and inspiration for how we grow and give back to the community and interact with the land. We find it, often hard to kind of put this label on ourselves. We're talking today a lot about regenerative agriculture and climate resilience, but in a lot of different communities, folks don't always use that same language for the practices that they are, already practicing. I would say that for Mudbone and many of our partners, we are committed to building a more resilient, thriving, and entrepreneurial food and maker community in which cooperation, soil health, and shared economy are standard. Looking at business of growing food, community health, Black wealth, and using cultural resilience as a tool and strategy for placemaking around agriculture. And so some of the things that we've been really talking about, for opportunities to support growth are, also looking at supporting current programming and positions for Black and Indigenous green workforce development, really putting a focus on capacity building. I think that's really important. Putting equity first, and funding land acquisition and infrastructure projects for Black-led and POC businesses to build generational wealth. And then also looking at funding for green infrastructure projects, including site development implementation of conservation plans and labor costs. Because oftentimes you get on the land or you get access to land, but then you don't have any money to like develop the site, or you don't have funding to like help with the labor costs because, and then it becomes a volunteer opportunity, and, people get really stretched too thin. And so I think it's important to start, out the gate with some funding to be able to like have that breathing room to, take a pause, do more strategic planning and more collaboration with one another, and then be able to jump in and really implement and develop something that's, robust, or really enhance, have an opportunity to enhance what you already do and walk it out a little bit more.
Thank you. Megan, I'm going to turn it over to you to ask. I know that there are some prepared questions.
Yeah, I think
behind us.
so I sent these questions. I think they were co-generated with some of the staff and myself just in prepping for it. And I think you all got them in advance, hopefully, otherwise you have to turn around and look at them behind you. But rather than me taking through them, I also would like to just ask all the other committee members. This is, we have like about 25 minutes, I think. So, I mean, we could start, if you're lacking questions, we can start going through mine that I proposed, but I would like to hear what you all want to hear.
Looks like Robin has a question.
Hi, thank you very much for being here and sharing a story. Megan, you earlier talked about, industrial food systems and kind of, a shift to regenerative systems. With 3 to 400 million people in the United States and, 3 to 4 million, whatever, in Oregon, how do we feed that many people with a non-industrial food system? And I guess, how can PCEF funds be deployed through your organizations to move that needle? I don't expect us to be able to solve that problem completely, but what can we do to move the needle, shifting from industrial to more of a regenerative system? Thank you.
I can start. I think a big issue is not necessarily the amount of food that we're producing, but the cost of that food. And I think that especially in Portland and our farms, like we're able to grow enough produce to feed the folks. It's just a matter of like making it accessible to them and letting them know that they can either get subsidies or things like that to afford it. And I think PCEF funds, like Jason was talking about, like funding our already existing like gardening programs and farming programs would like just keep that production at the level that it's at. And I think it also looks like people growing in their home spaces or any places that they have access to land. So you might not be able to like fully feed your family with the groceries that you're growing in your garden for, the full month, but maybe you can do it for a couple of days. So I think it does look like, organizations that help support folks grow in their backyards and their front spaces, as well as organizations like ours, which have a larger access to land growing for the community.
Want to add something?
Yeah. So when you asked that question, my mind immediately went to cooperative economics. And so at Mudbone, we talk a lot about, organizing small producers to get to that level of being able to produce on an institutional level. And so it takes many hands to make the work light, right? And so, a lot of the producers that we work with in organizations, Black Food Sovereignty Coalition is doing a lot of work around cooperative, economics and getting people together. And we're also working with other small, farmers. And so if we all come together to be able to grow that food to meet those demands, we can do that in a very intentional and regenerative manner without creating a huge impact when it comes to the environment.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. Like Dr. Horst said, this is a really complex issue, especially our food system, that is going to take multiple approaches that are dynamic, that are engaging with the populations that are living here in this community, that think about regenerative agriculture, right? That for folks who are coming from multiple parts of the world, that's normal. That's what they've done, and we're trying to then say that we're going to then help educate them on what that is, and that's not the truth. Is that there's folks coming who have that experience, and I'd say investing in those folks and that leadership and listening to them on what they want to have in their food system is a really great starting point to a big, I think, great question. I think you all have a really exciting opportunity here to invest in the work that's being done, but also to then show what's possible with this very innovative fund to then support work that's being done on multiple levels within the food system. So if that's agriculture and farming, or working with community leaders on getting gardens built in their backyards, or at schools, right? We do schoolwork, Grow Portland does schoolwork, Village Gardens does work with getting a local Healthy Corner grocery store built, right? There's so many components that we have locally within the food system that we have to start with the work that's being done. Y'all have years at this, right? So I think what I'm trying to bring to this discussion is that there's people in our community that are engaged with our organizations that have a lot of these answers, and I'd say investing in them, investing in their leadership, and paying them for this, right? Like, they're bringing knowledge and experience, and that shouldn't just be taken for granted.
I think also, sorry. Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say too, I think with the slide you had up of the opportunities and the challenges, I think one of them that was really apt was institutional demand. So I think the more schools are using local produce and local farms to put the food in their cafeterias, or we have a program called CSA Partnerships for Health, where we've been working with healthcare providers to subsidize CSA memberships as kind of prescriptions from doctors, and are really close to getting approval for CSA subscriptions to be funded through like your health savings account or your flexible spending account. So I think the more we can institutionalize access, then it creates more demand also for farmers, and they can plan and have more security in terms of knowing how much food they can sell and grow, like bringing it beyond farmers market, but to like actually having ongoing contracts with local institutions that distribute food or subsidize food to access to their patients or to their students is a really great way to expand as well.
Can I just say something to add on from like I guess an academic comment that's bigger, like it's a couple levels up from this. But Robin, you asked like, how do we feed the world, which I don't think we have to worry about that exact scale of question here in the room.
Metro.
But to that question, I mean, the reality is that the world overproduces food right now. The reason people are hungry is because of poverty and because of distribution and because of greed, corporate greed, right? It's not actually a production problem, and it won't be at 10 billion people either. Climate change will complicate some of this, but it's not a production problem right now. So that's kind of one. And, you know, industrialization has pushed the vast majority of people around the globe off of farming, including right here in this country. We've gone from most people growing food to like less than 2% of the population because of industrialization forces. Anyway, so, but it's, feeding the world is not a production question usually. It's often a distribution and anti-poverty question. So it's kind of one take. And then another one is, but to your Portland question, there have been studies looking at like, if we were to totally max out all available land for pretty great kind of urban growing practices, you know, based on the estimates these all are doing on their best plots, how much food could we grow? And the numbers are pretty good. We could grow a lot of fruits and vegetables right here in the city of Portland, and more if we expand broader. And some protein and some, you know, we would not be growing everyone's beef habits, but here in the city of Portland, but we could grow a significant amount of food if there were kind of, if that amount of land could get mobilized. So we could grow a lot of fruits and vegetables, which Americans desperately don't eat enough of. So we could, just to kind of push back on the, we have to feed the world thinking.
Ranfis?
Just want to thank Megan and the panelists for the presentation. This is not my like strong suit area, so I'm like really thankful to be able to take a little dive into these concepts. So thank you all for this. Some of the sort of the things that have come up for me as thinking as a committee member as we're going into like beginning to think about the design of the grant program, especially in this specific area. A couple of things I've heard was like one, collaboration or the ability to assess what's out there. So just wanted to make sure that I heard that correctly, and if either of you can speak more on the importance of that. And then two, I heard the word institutionalizing. So how do we, is that the suggestion for designing a potential program, grant-making program that incentivizes or collaboration with other partners to sort of like school districts to institutionalize some of these programs. So I guess I just had sort of those questions as we're thinking about design of the grant-making program.
Colleen or Shantae, I feel like the questions were sort of related to things that you said. Did either of you want to respond?
Sure. So that question maybe was in reference to me mentioning institutional markets, and maybe, I don't know. But I would say that there shouldn't be any guidelines on what markets people should focus on or urban farms should focus on. That shouldn't be part of the grant requirement. I feel strongly that like gardeners or urban farmers should be able to choose what markets that they want to participate in to keep it open. But I do think that there does need to be a strong focus on collaboration and community benefit. There's a lot of opportunities to, focus on, having flexible funding around the land acquisition and green infrastructure. And as you know, we only have so much green space in the city. And so I think it's really important with this funding to really like lead with equity first, and look at infrastructure projects that are led by Black and Indigenous and POC folks that, look at helping to kind of build that generational wealth. So Megan mentioned, a little bit about the Organ Donation Land Act and exclusion laws that many community members have not benefited from, specifically communities of color with suffered from the exclusion laws. And specifically in agriculture. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling here, but I'm going to get to where I need to be. I guess what I'm trying to say is that with the exclusion law and with the Organ Donation Land Act, it has excluded a lot of Black folks, POC folks, from participating in agriculture. Oregon is a huge agricultural state, and so I think that the funding should really be focused on helping to build the capacity of the people that have been excluded and leading with that first.
Yeah, I agree with Shantae, and I would also add that that one of the opportunities that we have is that there are a lot of people that are growing in this area in Portland, and a lot of like folks are interested in urban farming and gardening in a way that hasn't been in the past couple of years. And we don't have as strong of informal or even formal networks to collaborate. And I think compared to the Northeast or even the South, where you have a lot more strong like cooperative or kind of network models, I think ours is a little bit weaker. So I think what we can do is like incentivize us to like work together on the things that we're kind of already doing, and maybe continue to build those kind of formalized networks.
I would say, yeah, collaboration is a really big component to this, right? That I think we're trying to do that on our, informally, but I think this is a process to then formalize that. I also think that this is a game changing, right? Like this fund that is coming online is dramatic, right? And so it puts us in a realm of being able to then be pretty big decision makers, right? If this funds comes to hopefully our organizations, that it puts us into realms to then talk with, potential for-profit partners and other, maybe in the private sector or government or universities, and that it gives us that credibility as well financially and kind of like that power, which is really, really big. So I think for me, it's kind of just broader as opposed to maybe just all of us as nonprofits, but it's a bigger circle that could go out from there.
Michael?
First of all, thank you all for coming out. I had a question about land access, especially for people of color who've traditionally not been allowed to own land, have not been able to finance land, whether it's home properties or actual crop land. what is your experience and what troubles do you have here in acquiring land, and how much of the land that you currently have are you using? Are you finding that you have more land than you need, or I guess I'm wondering how land acquisition kind of works for you, yeah.
So currently right now we're on 19 acres in Corbett, which part of it is forested. And the other part is used as an incubator farm and different programming that we have going on for our Pathways to Farming program. And the other portion of the Pathways to Farming program of the farmers that we work with is at the Oregon Food Bank, which that site total is about 2.5 acres. So our incubator farm is kind of where we're supporting other Black, Indigenous, POC farmers to create farm businesses. And help, supporting them with things like seeds and mentorship and wraparound support. We have had a range of different experiences with being able to lease land or operate on land. So I could tell you we've had probably about maybe around 5 to 7 different sites that we've helped to activate. And what happens for us a lot of the time is we start off at one site for a season. Somebody will give us an opportunity at an urban farm site, and then we'll have to move. And so you put a lot of time and energy, into building up the site, building that soil up. Maybe you're building a wash pack station. If it's an urban location, you're also, trying to build community, and all of that takes time. Another location, we had it for 2 seasons, but then they, needed to build affordable housing on it. So we found, I feel like with urban farming, not just us, but a lot of other urban farmers are being displaced constantly and trying to look for that new semi-permanent location where they can set up shop for a good amount of time, put infrastructure in and investment. I think that our experience, because even on the 19 acres, we don't own that 19 acres. We're just on a 5-year lease per se, but we are looking to eventually get to land ownership, but that takes capital and it also takes, that takes time. And so, I think that in the urban environment, there's only so much green space, and a lot of farms are coming up against having to almost compete with, our housing crisis and new buildings and development happening, but, green space isn't really being considered. And so I think that we have to get really creative as urban farms, or urban farmers or rural farmers, when it comes to access to land as people of color or Black folks. So the idea is to eventually, own and operate on a good piece of land where you could then, share it with other people, but then you can really pour everything that you have into that land and feel like this isn't going to be ripped out from underneath me at any moment, and I'm going to have to take up, break down a greenhouse and leave certain things and then move on.
Thank you. I know Shanice has a question, but if there's anything that any of the other panelists want to add quickly.
Yeah, just so especially for the home side, right? Working with individuals in their home. I mean, you hit on a couple. So home ownership, gentrification, obviously, lack of affordable housing, landlords that say no, that won't allow it to happen. I'd also say the increase of property taxes, kind of pricing people out of where they historically have been, and then not having access to that land anymore. Access to water is also another really big issue. Contaminated soils. We're working on just within our home gardens program, we're about 3 acres. It's about 1,500 families that we're working with across our organization, and so and that's all done in an urban setting in the backyards of folks. So it's kind of unseen, right? You're not going to drive down the street and see a huge farm being taken place, but there are these small plots across the metro area that's taking place.
Shanice?
I just want to comment and thank y'all for the work you're doing and what you shared. And I think that in terms of some conversations about cooperative work, collaboration, just for committee members, ourselves. I think these folks are really leaders locally and nationally, and I think the space of capacity building through our process and through the work already happening on the ground, addressing regenerative agriculture, I think is essential. And I think there's some pieces that I'm just sitting with and what it looks like to double tap on this conversation on cooperative economics. And I think getting the opportunity to take some young folks to Corbett and see the mud-bone grown space. I think these conversations around land acquisition and collaboration, I think we should prioritize that as we move forward and think about some of the capacity needs for these folks to maximize already the impact that community is feeling. But yeah, I think a lot of the questions that are up here are already kind of touched on through conversation, and I think the cooperative economics piece would be great for me to understand more about what's most helpful, what works and doesn't work already for folks, and some specifics that could help us in our grant making that's responsive to those actual things. But yeah.
I think a good starting point would be, we've all kind of touched on it, being able to collaborate more. And for me, with the cooperative economics, you're also able to share resources, and probably funding and those kind of things. But I think a good starting point for this grant would be to look at funding multiple year strategic planning in agriculture, so that we have the time to be able to sit with one another and really come up with a comprehensive plan and look at where our intersections are and how we want to operate and move forward. And so, starting there, I think that Black Food Sovereignty Coalition, and I know Edward Hill's back there, could speak more to.
His hand just came out from behind the wall.
Could speak more around Black Food Sovereignty Coalition's, strategic plan around cooperative economics. And so I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I think also to agree with what you said, I think collaboration is really key, but I also think having the space to collaborate means having the funding to do what you're already doing, to give you the spaciousness to connect with other people. And I think so often grant making is what's your new project? What's your new collaboration? What's the new program you need to fund? And really thinking about how we fund what's already happening to give us that room to think bigger, and also recognizing that the programming that we're doing is in direct response to our communities and what they're asking for. So we're already there and we're doing that. So how do you all come in and support that and amplify it, and then give us the space to connect and think of how does that grow with collaborating with each other? So I think when I say collaboration, I'm yes, I'm excited for collaboration, but then I think sometimes there's this way that grant making happens where it says what's your new project with your new partner, with your new collaboration, and not really thinking of it in that way, but thinking of it as it's organically what it's already happening, but how do we get more space and time and energy to do it and further it and see where it goes and lift it up, as opposed to kind of funding some sort of new thing.
Maria?
Thank you all for your comments, and Megan for bringing this panel together to talk about a topic I know you care a lot about. We had a retreat this past weekend, and we, were inundated with lots of big concepts and really personal issues that we want to tease out as we embark on all this decision making. But some of the themes that resonated with me in our conversations were around how do we define or identify what's impactful, what's local. You know, we definitely want to make sure we're focusing on Black, Indigenous, and people of color and low-income people. But, you know, what is local, and how local do we go? You know, how do we define the breadth, depth, and specificity of programs that will really resonate and respond? So we lean on all of you to continue telling us the stories of what's really working and what's needed. You can do it through data, you can do it through all kinds of means, but please continue feeding that information to staff and to your community members so we could really see, because many of us are not experts in food and food systems, but we are deeply interested and invested in knowing how the 10 to 15% should be allocated to this type of work. So thank you.
Megan, did you want to make any closing comments? We are at time. Nope. Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of you very much for coming. It's nice to meet you in person since we've been emailing. Now we know what each other looks like. And I'd ask that if folks are, if folks in the audience who are here just for the regenerative agriculture section and you're going to leave, if you could just make sure, and there is a sign-up sheet in the back. June is pointing to it right now. And you can sign up to get on our mailing list and get notification of future meetings and other events. So if you are going to leave, if you could do that, and we'll just take maybe 2 minutes to swap out presenters and move on to talking about green infrastructure. Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you. That was really, really great. And I feel like we need to start like having gifts for presenters or something. I'm like, thank you, bye. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, be really careful. This is like my worst fear is that someone's gonna fall before the end of the day. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Katie. Nice to meet you in person. Yeah, no, thank you guys very much. Exciting stuff. It is. Yeah. Totally exciting. And I have to say, I'm not even going to I'm moved to Alaska, and so I've been like doing all of this sort of like reading and research. I also grew up in Alaska, or I don't know if you grew up in Alaska. 38. Yeah. No, I moved. I was born there and raised there, and then moved to high school to Colorado. So I didn't like stay completely. Yeah. I always like knew about Alaska, you know, because we would like, you know, the state fair, there's like yeah, we had it when I was growing up. We produced all of our food. Yeah. Yeah. When we had chickens, you know, sometimes through a lot of marijuana. Yes. Yeah. So my community. All right, I'm gonna go locate this.
Take this chair. How many people are going to be up? With you? We have Jen with Cairo. We have. Yep, we got 4. That's great. Yeah, I saw Todd back there. I saw us one back there. I'm going to go grab Todd. Yeah, that's not Todd's here. I'm going to go grab him.
Okay, if I could ask everyone to wrap up your conversations, make sure you've gotten a drink of water, and then sit back down. We're going to restart the meeting here in just 30 seconds. Might have been a lie. Yeah, we'll see. Okay. So there is a clicker. It's just that little thing right there. And so they could, I'm reluctant to move from here. Oh, there's two of them? Yes, okay. I'm Katie. Nice to meet you in person. Yes.
When they go up, I'll take the pointer to them. And they can
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. Okay, we're going to get started again. So if I could ask everybody to sit down or just stop talking. You can stay standing if you want. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is green infrastructure, and it is another one of the funding bucket areas. We have 4 organizations represented by 6 presenters. We're going to start out with some information from the Bureau of Environmental Services, and then move on to Portland Parks and Recreation, VOS Workers' Rights Education Project, and APANO, Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon. And so I'll ask, as each of the speakers gives their presentation, for them to tell you who they are and kind of how they fit within their organization. And we're going to pause. We're going to pause for questions, but mostly clarifying questions from committee members after the first presentation from the Bureau of Environmental Services, primarily because what we asked them to do was kind of give a high level, this is what green infrastructure in Portland kind of is and looks like. And then, so just mainly clarifying questions, not really conversation. Then we'll do the other 3 presentations and then open it up for conversation. So that's the plan. Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Look at the time. You'll tell me though.
I will tell you.
Thank you. Is this somebody else?
Yeah, this.
Oh, I went down.
Oh, it does. It's not intuitive. So push down to go forward.
Sure, down, forward.
Yes, that's right. Okay.
All together.
Yep. Make sure that you are on.
Can everybody hear me? In the back? Most likely. Thank you all for having me here tonight. My name is Jennifer Karps. I'm with the City of Portland's Bureau of Environmental Services, and I'm taking my 10 minutes to split it a little bit and talk to you generally about what is green infrastructure. Spoiler alert, you already know what it is. You will not be surprised when I start to talk about it, and I've chosen just to share a bunch of hopefully attractive images. And then I'll spend just a little bit of time talking about what that means to our Bureau, and by extension to the community that we serve, which is the community of the City of Portland. All right, my role with the Bureau is as a program coordinator for a program we call Neighborhood to the River. And through this program, we deliver sort of an integrated package of both capital projects, but also some non-capital, more community-focused projects. I manage a grant program through which we provide small grants up to roughly $12,000 for community investments that are not exclusive of things like investing in agriculture. And many of our partners are in the room, I'm excited to see, and may get a chance to talk to some folks later. But what is green infrastructure? The $64,000 question. So at its most basic elements, green infrastructure is those elements. It's a sort of a techie term that describes what we all intuitively know, which is basically things that are nature or act like nature within the construct of the built environment, the place where we live. So the images you see here are purposefully images that are, cityscapes, the built environment, and the ways in which we've incorporated green things into them. Things like eco-roofs, things like re-naturescaping, where we've got new developments, street trees, what we call green street facilities, which are street-side bioswales and planters. And then, of course, there's a human in the image here, which is someone taking care of or stewarding that green infrastructure, which is a hallmark of green as opposed to gray infrastructure. Gray infrastructure is absolutely necessary, but it's invisible. It's underground most of the time, at least in terms of our gray infrastructure. You flush the toilet, it goes away. Totally critical infrastructure, but not something that you need to tend to, hopefully, on a regular basis. So let's just look through a suite of some images to describe some of these green infrastructure elements. This is an example of a project that our Bureau did roughly 10 years ago. And the image with the car is the house is actually a triplex. I'll just say that's true, you won't know. That is no longer there. And what you see in the image on the right-hand side of the screen is what's there now. So it's a single-family residential lot in Southeast Portland that was purchased for the purposes of daylighting part of Crystal Springs Creek, which you see here in its early stages of restoration. And this, like I say, the site is 10 years mature by now, so the riparian vegetation is all built up and whatnot. But I love this project, and it's such an exciting example of what's possible in a relatively small space. And look at all that room left over for agriculture. I'm feeling a little defensive. That first, set of speakers was really compelling, and so I'm going to try to plug into that wherever I can. Another example is floodplain reclamation. The image you see on the right there is a place we call Foster Floodplain. And it used to be, the very poor image on the left is an example of when that used to be a residential neighborhood. What you see as open space and green space had a lot of homes there that would flood on a regular basis, roughly every 1 to more than 1 years. So imagine your house flooding every single year and the adjacent businesses on Foster Road flooding every year. We came in and bought all those people out, removed all of the houses, and reclaimed the floodplain. And now it's a natural area for folks to enjoy. And Foster doesn't flood quite as much anymore. Another great example of green infrastructure, and hopefully you're seeing as I talk through these quickly that we're really getting multiple benefits from these projects. Ostensibly, we're doing things like buying property, restoring it to manage stormwater more closer to the bone, if you will, but we're getting fantastic complementary benefits, wildlife habitat, watershed health, community improvement, et cetera. This is an example of the Riverview Natural Area, which is south of Riverview Cemetery on the west side of the Willamette River. And you can see there were 1 or 2 invasive plants that we needed to remove to restore the area. They're just downstream from here. This is a fairly steep slope where the Willamette River, it's basically where the Selwood Bridge is, just south of the Selwood Bridge. There's some really high quality salmon habitat, and so preserving this area is particularly important, again, not just for stormwater, but also for habitat. Tree planting, of course, you'll hear a lot more from the city forester about that, so I won't say too much, but just to say that wherever you can basically get a shovel and dig a hole in the ground, you can plant a tree, and some of those trees have food on them. But some nice examples of planting at a school on 82nd Avenue where we, got some de-paving done and then partnered with Chess for Success to build a chessboard with some trees on the corners to help dampen the noise, improve the air quality eventually, but then also provide some nice shade so you can play chess on a sunny day. And my favorite before and after, because the after picture is the lovely blue sky and just looks way more appealing than the before picture. Trees really do make a difference even right after you plant them. You can really see that, blue sky or not. This is just for laughs, but again, the Green Street facilities, these things that we put in to take your parking away because we're mean, that help to manage stormwater quite locally, retrofitting into the built environment, provide such a wonderful opportunity for stewards. You're seeing Green Street stewards on the right there, helping to keep them trash-free and weed-free. And I don't actually know the whole story of the gentleman swimming in the one on the left. I'm pretty sure I shouldn't show you this picture, but it's a kick, so I did it anyway. And then just a lovely little collage of green roofs. And we tend to invest in eco roofs, which are more the ones to the right. thin soil and extensive roof coverage versus the more intensive rooftop gardens, but they're all fair game. It's all green infrastructure. It all provides habitat for pollinators, habitat for humans, cools the buildings, does all matter of wonderful things. So green infrastructure, it's the green things. It's the elements in our built environment that help us to manage stormwater more naturally the way nature does. And it helps us, the Bureau of Environmental Services, meet our watershed health goals, which there are 4: improving hydrology, water quality, habitat for and fish and wildlife. So that's sort of the plant and infrastructure of the habitat, and then improving conditions for animals as well. And this is a wonky little image from our watershed management plan. I didn't bring the whole plan for you to page through. I only have 10 minutes, come on. But you can see that there are a number of activities that we and our partners get up to that we ourselves engage in and we fund to help to meet those watershed health goals. And this is where working at the surface with green infrastructure elements is so powerful, because when we plant a tree, we don't just get a tree like we do when we install a pipe. We also get potentially food, habitat, shade, improved air quality, improved walkability, community well-being, you name it. So it's exciting. I feel very grateful to get to work on this because I get to work with lots of community folks. And I think I probably got ahead of myself a little bit, but this might be my last slide, that green tools really help us to achieve not only multiple goals for the Bureau directly, but for the community, which, by the way, are Bureau goals as well. We're spending your money and hopefully meeting your needs. And so just so you know, we're thinking about that as we do our work. So thinking about climate change mitigation and adaptation, thinking about community health and neighborhood livability. I'd point out the cover of the climate change preparation strategy. This is a community planting one of those Green Street facilities that I showed you. So we really are thinking about these things as we move forward. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any, we do have about 5 or 10
yes.
minutes right now. If there are any questions from committee members for the Bureau of Environmental Services. Van Fees?
Just a couple of questions. Thank you for the presentation. I'm really curious if most of this work was done in-house within BES or if it was like contracted work. And then sort of a follow-up question, whether both for internally and external work or contracted work, if you will, give a sense of what the workforce equity or contract equity is, or and if that's something willing to be share for the committee for future understanding. And I think I'll just stop there. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. My answer is going to be somewhat brief because it's not my area of expertise across all of our green infrastructure work, but I can say a few things. Mm-hmm. I would say that some of the work that we do with green infrastructure involves volunteers. For example, the Green Street Stewards program. We work with a lot of community members and local groups, Surfrider, Solve, et cetera, and we empower them to take care of Green Street facilities for the sheer pleasure of doing it, for the certificate of thank you very much. So there is that element to some green infrastructure work, certainly. I would say when we're building Green Street facilities, these are engineered facilities. There's dig a hole in the ground, put concrete in, get a permit before you do all of that. And that work is certainly contracted out. And that's the work I can't speak to in terms of the equity implications of that work. Though I will say one of my Neighbor to the River projects, capital projects, is coming online. They're going to council tomorrow. And we just had a check-in meeting today. The MWESB, DMWESB portion of the whole, and I'm sorry, I'm not remembering, let's say it's $10 million, is 43%, which is radically high. Everybody was really, feeling amazing about it. So if you want to check out council tomorrow, you can learn more about that. And then somewhere in between there, and I can speak from our tree program, we have a program that plants trees proactively for stormwater management. We have 3 contracts that we work with. We plant almost all those trees through contract. most of the trees are planted by Friends of Trees, and there is particular equity language in that contract which requires them both intensive and extensive equity language. The extensive piece is that 75% of their services have to be offered within equity geographies, where low-income folks live in low canopy neighborhoods in poverty, essentially. At least one of the three of those, because we're trying to raise the bar sort of for everyone. And the other piece is that there's money set aside in the contract that is not for Friends of Trees to earn, but for Friends of Trees to partner with community benefit organizations such as Apano, et cetera, to earn. And so that is one way, certainly, where we've got a large chunk of what we're trying to accomplish, and we're being intentional and thoughtful about it.
All right, well, I think we're going to move to the next presenter. This is another Jennifer. Do you go by Jennifer or Jen?
I'm Jen.
Jen, okay. Jennifer, Jen. Jen Cairo is with Portland Parks and Rec. And so you push down to move forward.
Got it. Can you all hear me? Great. First, I have some handouts I'm going to send around. First for the committee members, please, and then either to the left, you're welcome to take them if you're interested. So I am Jen Cairo, the city forester and the urban forestry manager with Parks and Recreation. And with me tonight, I want to introduce Gina Dake, who is a forestry botanic specialist. There she is. Could you stand up? Thank you, Gina. And one of the reasons I wanted you to see her is one of the handouts is our newsletter Tree Bark that Gina puts together for us at least once or twice a month. So now you know who that is. She's also the wearer of many other hats. She runs the city's Heritage Tree Program and also our Youth Conservation Crew Tree Cruise, which you'll hear more about later. So I was invited tonight not just to speak to you as the city forester, but also to represent the broader context of what Portland Parks and Recreation does. Where it involves green infrastructure and potentially may have some collaboration and connection with PCEF's work. So I'm going to encourage you to think broadly about how parks might collaborate with you. It's a broad organization, and I won't be able to hit everything on it tonight. Okay. First, a little bit of what Parks and Recreation does sort of by the numbers. So you'll see here that Parks is responsible for owning and managing on all of our behalf almost 12,000 acres in the city, and 8,000 of those are natural areas, things like Riverview that you heard about earlier. Also developed parks like the park right across the street from us here and Cully Park, where the Cully Cultural Garden is and community gathering places. Also 157 miles of trail in the city and approximately 1.4 million park trees. So that's about 15% of the property in the city of Portland that's owned and managed by parks. So when it comes to green space and green infrastructure in the city, Parks is one of the largest, if not the largest owners of that structure for all of us. And the city has a service goal for parks and natural areas that each resident be within a half-mile walking distance of a park or a natural area. And you see here that goal is not met at present. East Portland, home to most of Portland's low-income residents and communities of color, has the fewest parks and natural areas. In fact, 2 in 5 people are further than that half-mile walk from a park or natural area. And perhaps this presents some sort of opportunity for PCEF to consider. And I'm going to speak a little bit about one of my partner groups in Parks and Rec, Land Stewardship, the city's green space managers. So those parks and natural areas I talked about before, these are the folks who do that work day to day and in the long term. And these are some of their program areas that are green infrastructure related and may be of interest to PCEF. So as I said, maintenance of things like the Cully Park Native Gathering Gardens and the many other parks and natural areas in the city, that's one of their primary functions. Also, Land Stewardship manages the Parks Community Gardens program. There are 57 community gardens spread across the city, and they comprise together around 1,000 plots that are given out under a low-cost lease program for residents to use to grow their own food, have some food security, some healthier foods, especially for folks who don't have land available to do that. And that's largely for their own personal use. There's also environmental education programs that Land Stewardship conducts, and they're nature education programs for all ages. They're also maintenance partnerships and volunteer work in parks and natural areas, and they're also paid natural resource career development opportunities. And the intention of those is to inspire and help people prepare for natural resource careers, such as high school students or middle school students who might not have considered working in natural resources as a career or profession before. And those are the workforce development initiatives. And I'm speaking very broadly about these. There are many different types of programs within those categories for land stewardship. Now I'll switch over to urban forestry. So as Bureau of Transportation is to roads and traffic in the city, and Bureau of Environmental Services is to wastewater management, and the Water Bureau is to our drinking water supply. Parks Urban Forestry is to trees and the urban forest. Trees are essential urban forest infrastructure and green infrastructure, just like the roads, sewer system, drinking water supply. And that's a relatively new concept. Urban forestry is a relatively new field. I think most of the time, many of us think of trees and forests as being something outside the city in wildlands and natural areas. But of course, most of us humans, we live in cities and we need the tree services right where we live every day. So urban forestry is responsible for tree care and regulation for all the city properties and streets, and the street trees along those streets, and also for tree regulations that the city has that pertain to private properties. Most of urban forestry's work is not on parks properties, but is really across the whole city in all of those areas. So parts of that work, and some of these may be germane for PCEF, some may not. I'm going to let you be the judge. We respond to tree emergencies in streets and on city property 24/7. And that's the picture in the middle. You can see somebody, a climber, up there with their chainsaw, doing some of the harder work of that type of emergency work. We also developed and run the city's single point of contact for trees, and that's the one side of the card that was passed around, if you got that. That's 823-TREE and trees@portlandoregon.gov. So any questions you have, or tree in a street, or you want to know if you need a permit for something, or you even want advice on what tree to put where, you can give that number a call, and we'll help you out with that. We also have many education and outreach programs. A large part of urban forestry is really community forestry. It's really about residents being the stewards of the forest in their own neighborhood. So we have extensive tree planting programs with many partners, and you heard some of those mentioned earlier, and also partnerships for trees in the forest with many public and private entities. And each year we work a lot with volunteers, so much so that in 2018 we had 65,400 volunteer hours in partnership with forestry. And that's equivalent to 36 full-time staff positions, and our whole group is only 45. So when we talk about collaboration and volunteers and community stewardship in urban forestry, it's essential to what we do. And I think there's probably good opportunities there for PCEF. We also work to see our own workforce, so our own staff, as well as the profession of urban forestry and arboriculture, better serve and reflect the communities of people of color and women. Like many natural resource fields, forestry is traditionally white and male. So we work with partners like Vaz and Apano, who I thought might be here today. I haven't seen anybody though from Apano. I'm sorry, Jenny, sorry, so bad. Sitting behind you wasn't really helpful there. And have paid programs like internships, free urban forestry trainings, and the Youth Conservation Crew Tree Crew, which I mentioned earlier, that Gina Dake runs in our shop. And that's one of the parks programs that provides paying summer urban forestry work to historically underserved high school student populations to help them hopefully become tree care professionals someday. And I'm getting towards the end of this here. So why does all of that matter? Well, in terms of green infrastructure, we all can't live without trees. And you see here on this slide just some of the services that we all get every day from trees in our city. And this is not all of them. But with increasing populations and growing cities, including Portland growing, and forest loss across the globe and the growing climate crisis, trees are more important than ever for these essential services that they provide for all of us. So we have a saying in our arboriculture, trees are the answer. It's a bumper sticker on a few cars in our parking lot. They're certainly at least part of the answer to climate change, green jobs growth, and environmental justice. That one I'm going to skip for the sake of time. If you want to come back later, I can talk about that one later. So this slide shows our average tree canopy coverage on each side of the Willamette River. West of the Willamette River, communities enjoy about 56% tree canopy. Even if we take Forest Park out of that, it's still 44% on the west side. East of the Willamette, tree canopy is 21%. That's lower than the city of Los Angeles's average tree canopy. We think of ourselves as very green. Maybe Los Angeles not so much, but when it comes to the difference between east and west, we're not very green on the east side. So this disparity especially affects the health and quality of life for Portlanders east of the Willamette. And think for a moment about who lives east of the Willamette. Consistently in Portland and many American cities, we see communities of color, immigrant and refugee communities, and low-income people, the historically and institutionally marginalized residents, receive less service from trees and other green infrastructure like parks. So, that being the case, Urban Forestry recently undertook a project with Portland State University and many residents, primarily from underserved neighborhoods and communities of color, to hear from them how they value trees and how together we can improve those essential tree services in their neighborhoods. And the report on this work is called Growing a More Equitable Urban Forest, and is Portland's city tree planting strategy, which we are now beginning to implement. 4 of the several findings of that report include that we should continue to prioritize low-income and low-canopy areas for community forestry, tree planting, and other tree work. The second, we need to increase strategic tree planting, focusing primarily in those areas. Third, we need to partner with local community organizations to plant and steward trees in their neighborhoods, and I'll say a little bit more about that one. We do this work now, but we'd like to do more and in the highest need areas of the city and with more partners and organizations who represent and reflect their neighborhoods. So here's something we think PCEF could work on with us: supporting and creating capacity for local community-run nonprofits for forest stewardship, tree planting, and forestry professional development programs. We see this working in other places. So Los Angeles again, they just recently announced a 3-year, 90,000 tree planting effort. They're gonna get 90,000 trees in, which is a lot in 3 years. And a key to them doing that is they have several partner organizations that are nonprofits that they work directly with to do this work in various parts of town. So we think that's an interesting model. And the fourth of the findings from Growing a More Equitable Urban Forest is the desire for the city to be responsible for street tree maintenance. So currently, the trees along the streets, the ones that you have in front of your house, hopefully, or drive or walk past, those are city property and they provide a public service, so for everyone, not just the folks who live next door to them. However, according to the city's policies, the adjacent property owner is required to maintain that tree with their own funds. So this creates a significant burden for property owners, especially folks who are lower income, and a real barrier to having more street trees and those tree services right where people live. Meantime, most large cities and many not so large cities in the US, the city does maintain the street trees. It's not the adjacent property owner's responsibility. That's the case in Los Angeles, San Diego, Salem, Eugene, Vancouver, Washington, San Francisco, New York City, Chicago, the District of Columbia, the list goes on. So changing this policy is first and foremost a funding need. If we had the resources, we'd already be maintaining those street trees instead of putting that responsibility on the property owner next door. And this could also be, this idea, if it comes to fruition, could also be a significant opportunity for professional development, green jobs, green infrastructure partnerships. For example, What if, in coordination with urban forestry, we had apprenticeships and trainee programs around street tree maintenance for folks who haven't normally worked in the urban forestry profession? What if community partners, nonprofits, and commercial firms owned and staffed by people of color perform the many jobs of street tree maintenance? What if we help those entities become strong and capable contractors and collaborators for street tree maintenance? Last one. This is just a list of links for you all to use that are websites for many of the things that I mentioned today. I want to point out that the Get Involved pages for urban forestry, which is more than halfway down the list there, include our neighborhood tree teams, neighborhood tree stewards, some small grant programs we have for those, and many of those forest stewardship and education opportunities like the tree crew that I mentioned earlier. You can also sign up for Tree Bark, the newsletter that some of you have, at that link. And the last thing, at the bottom of this list, you'll see a council work session link. And that link is for a project called Sustainable Future. And this is a new Portland Parks initiative supported by City Council that's intended to find a sustainable and sufficient funding base for parks. Parks has had budget cuts over the past several years that have been pretty impactful. Last year, 70 positions were eliminated and people lost their jobs and our services were curtailed. Again, there's 45 people in our whole group, so 70 people from a whole bureau is a lot. So without a new stable way of funding Parks and Rec, reductions like this are going to continue to happen. And I mention that because maybe there's a role for PCEF in that, seeing as parks is a big part of green infrastructure in the city. That's all I have. Thanks for your time. And Katie, if Katie has time, we can answer questions.
We do not. Right now. We have about 25 minutes on the agenda left, but we do have two more presenters who made their way out here on this evening, weekday evening. So we're going to first move to, oh, did we lose Osmani? He'll be, oh, he's back. Okay. So we're going to turn it over to Vos, who's going to, I think, focus in on some workforce development and training in this space, and then close out with Apano, which has kind of a case study that highlights some aspects of what everybody has talked about, really.
Okay, awesome. Good evening, everyone. My name is Osmani Alcaraz Ochoa. I'm the Executive Director of VOS Worker Rights Education Project. And we're passing around a brochure. There's enough for everyone in the room, I believe. And that says visual, as we're going to get tonight. So for myself, I'm new to Portland. I'm here I come from a lot of places, and including Jalisco, Mexico, the San Francisco Bay Area, Tucson, Arizona, Houston, Texas, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and now I'm living here in Portland. And I'm tremendously thrilled and honored and humbled to be at VOS. The story of VOS is a history of survival and collective resistance. In the 1990s, there was a wave of repressive tactics by immigration officials and local police that discouraged day laborers from seeking work on Portland street corners. In response, day laborers began organizing and found they shared common experiences around exploitation, wage theft, and houselessness. In 1998, the Day Labor Project, a project of the Workers' Organizing Committee, was formed, and through strategic grassroots organizing and advocacy efforts, the Day Labor Project stopped all raids on the intersections in the Central East Side Industrial District and successfully began reclaiming stolen wages. As the Day Labor Project built momentum and continued to empower other day laborers, the project separated from the Workers' Organizing Committee, and in 2000 grew into VOS Worker Rights Education Project. In short, VOS was born out of community building and community defense, responding to gentrification, criminalization and racial profiling, wage theft, worker exploitation, and xenophobia and white supremacy. In 2000, VOS was founded, and it is the only day labor worker center in the state of Oregon. Day laborers are temporary workers, largely immigrant, Latino, Black, African American, all facing multiple barriers to long-term employment. VOS builds leadership and economic power amongst day laborers through economic empowerment, leadership development, and grassroots organizing. In 2008, VOS became a 501c3 nonprofit and opened the Martin Luther King Jr. Worker Center. The mission of our Worker Center is to provide safe, dignified, and organized location to day laborers to find economic opportunities and connect to employers. Our staff help to match workers to employers, negotiate a fair wage, ensure workers will have the necessary safety equipment, and overall dignified working conditions. The Martin Luther King Jr. Worker Center offers a number of programs, such as a worker defense clinic, education in terms of trainings around Know Your Rights, advocacy topics, and political education with themes focused on gender equity, racial, economic, and climate justice. A leadership school and a workforce development program. And within that program, is where we have engaged with partners to develop a workforce focused on green jobs and infrastructure. And for that piece, Mo, our interim Worker Center director, will go a little bit more in depth into that.
Thank you. So yeah, like Osmani said, I work mostly at our worker center with the day laborers on a daily basis. These last couple of years have been very transformative for VOS, and since the end of 2018, we have decided to focus more on green workforce development with our main objectives in mind to increase economic opportunity, as well as build leadership within the worker community to take agency over the issues that affect them. So environmental justice is very much a focus that we've wanted to take on for some time. And so at the end of 2018, we contracted an organization, People, Places, Things, to help consult and help develop a workforce development program. And in this last year, all of 2019, they've done tons of work to build partnerships with BES and Verde and Treecology, Friends of Trees, several different parks, right here, Junkie Delta, lots of different partnerships to begin developing opportunities to not only develop skills for the day laborers, but introduce them to the issues that affect them, and increase economic opportunities for them. So we have, for instance, in July, BES provided us with an opportunity to learn basic skills in stormwater management, restoration, stewardship, and contribute to a cleaner Willamette River through hands-on activities in bioswales near the Worker Center. Since then, VOS has adopted bioswales, in which we have upheld monthly maintenance and training activities to start introducing workers to this project. And BES is now committed to providing them with monthly trainings and any other information that we could need to help engage the workers and get them more motivated to get into this type of work. From here, the Worker Center, since then, the Worker Center has continued in collaboration with Master Gardeners and Verde to bring in on-site gardening and landscaping trainings that not only initiated a landscaping training pilot for VOS workers, it also beautified public green spaces at the King Elementary School. And in order to expand VOS's reach and ability to train workers to relevant green space landscaping and restoration skills, we've confirmed partnerships with Junkie Delta, like I said, in Nadaka Nature Park as well. That's our most recent partnership where we have plans to continue forward with developing a landscape and restoration project. And that is also a partnership with Outgrowing Hunger. So we're set to keep maintaining the Nadaka Nature Park, which is going to be a site for advanced skills trainings in order to carry out restoration projects designed by the City of Gresham and Outgrowing Hunger. So overall, moving forward, VOS would like to bring in more support to increase advanced skills, more capacity to preserve urban green space, and increasing awareness among day labor community about environmental equity issues. The goal of our restoration project is to build and maintain on-site training for workers to be introduced to topics such as native plant identification, invasive species, environmental justice and equity, stormwater management, pesticide reduction, rain garden maintenance, tool identification and use, and safety precautions on the field. The list goes on and on. VOS would like to connect day laborers to more local restoration and green infrastructure projects, such as with more Portland public schools that have green spaces that could use support with maintenance, hands-on restoration work, such as more tree planting activities, which I forgot to mention. We did do a tree planting at the beginning of 2019 with BES and several other partners. Another goal that VOS would like to move forward with is enhancing economic opportunities for workers by way of tracking their engagement in the restoration and green infrastructure trainings organized through this project and other green workforce competencies provided by VOS. To increase participation, VOS aims to incentivize day labor participation with stipends and a point system that results in an in-house certification. This certifying of the workers will lead to higher paying jobs, and certifications qualify workers for higher wage jobs. I just said that. With the advancement of certifications and a fortified green capacitation program, the Worker Center will be able to attract more private landscaping firms and employers who will hire day laborers on a short and long-term basis. Finally, we would like support we would like support from PCEF to consider investing in making a hub where informal workers can get training in green jobs by supporting the Martin Luther King Jr. Worker Center have its own permanent building.
And then just to wrap up, I think we're over time, but just to conclude, we were also asked about anything that the committee should avoid. And then we have a couple considerations around that. One is consider avoiding one-year restricted grants and consider multi-year general operating dollars. Another one is to consider prioritizing organizations that are majority staff, leadership, and board that are people of color serving people of color. Another one, to consider funding operating costs to help keep the lights on for organizations led by and serving people of color and are already doing it and are able to do the work that aligns with PCEF. And then lastly, to consider not making the application process burdensome, and for example, accepting grant proposals written for other foundations, piece of researching the organization yourself, and then also speaking to organization representatives over the phone or in person in a grant process that doesn't take any organization more than 3 hours. Just very specified and measured based on past experiences. And then in short, just to end, we recommend PCEF to avoid replicating the inequities already present in the funding world and how grant processes, guidelines, and allocations happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Apano, you are up. We have Mai and Todd, and you do need the clicker.
Thank you.
So
I don't have any slides, but maybe you will. So I'm happy to start talking. Press down. Oh. Woohoo! We got it. Good evening, everyone. My name is Todd Struble, and I'm the Community Development Director at Apano. I want to talk a little bit about, we're going to go into detail about an EPA Greening America's Communities design grant that we got, and maybe we'll have some awesome pictures, but I'll talk a little bit more about how we got there and where, like, what's happened to get to that point and kind of what's happened afterwards. So it starts with our work in the Jade District. We have been working in Southeast Portland around the corner of Southeast 82nd Division and Southeast 82nd and Southeast Division for about 5 or 6 years now. And part of the reason we're out there is that it has the highest concentration of Asian and Pacific Islanders, but it's also one of the most diverse and low-income communities in Portland. And it faces some specific issues around green infrastructure, specifically climate related issues of like it's like an urban heat island. We've talked about like a lack of tree canopy in those areas, and also air quality. It's at the confluence of 84 and 205. You can kind of imagine all the cars that are stuck in congestion. That particulate just ends up landing in that part of Portland. And so there was a process that kind of mimics the public infrastructure process for a lot of things. There's planning, design, implementation, and then evaluation. So for the planning piece of this, it really came out of a process called Organ Solutions. This was actually brought forward by Opal and Senator Dembro's office, presented to the governor, where if like several different agencies, basically if everyone can agree that there is a specific issue impacting an area, then all of these different partners will come together to sit at the same table and create or try to work on solving that issue. And so that created a partnership where we got to sit at the same table with a lot of the partners that you see here, such as BES, BPS, Friends of Trees, Opal, and a number of other organizations that we've worked with. And that led to also applying for an EPA grant, a design grant. So that moves us into the design phase, which we'll see a little bit more in a second here. And that really helped us, do that community visioning, bringing folks from the community to talk about opportunity sites and what visions they could have for some of those specific sites, and how we could use the professional expertise of some of our partners to include green infrastructure in those designs. But while that was happening, we were also moving forward on other projects of implementation and improving air quality in the neighborhood. Some folks already mentioned with Jenny the tree planting that we did with Carol Lee. We had resources to have Carol go out to businesses in the Jade District and along 82nd in Southeast Portland to just ask them, do you want a free tree? And we had this basically resulted in hundreds of trees being planted from receptive business owners who oftentimes sometimes there's a preconception that they might not want to maintain the trees or would be resistant for some reason, but that wasn't what we found at all. And then we also had some other various projects like a pedestrian bridge with PBOT. We had an ugly pedestrian bridge that a lot of folks in the neighborhood were like, can we do something about that? And so there was an artist that went around and chatted with folks and brought a public art project to that bridge. And then finally, evaluation. We recently received a grant through Friends of Trees, which won this evaluation grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Willamette Partnership. And so we'll be able to kind of do a deep dive into what the impact of that green infrastructure, what those trees are actually going to mean for the people that live and experience the additional tree canopy. Yeah, so that's kind of that process that we've gone in. I think, as you'll see from May's grant, there's still a lot of work that we have to do and things that we would continue to want to implement. And I think PCEF can be a part of that solution.
Yeah, so hello everyone, my name is Mei Yi. I use they and she pronouns, and I'm a Jade District community organizer. Gonna make some eye contact. Feels kind of weird presenting this way. But like Todd said, we really kind of have these really community-centered milestones of really how do we plan, create, implement, and then also evaluate any certain project or investment while also keeping the community centered. And so, as Katie had said before, we have this case study of the EPA Greening America's Communities like visioning and design process. Here you can see kind of details around this EPA program. We worked with a great design team, or we collaborated with Multnomah County in this EPA program. And then we also worked with a great design team, Multicultural Collaborative, Resolve, Kumar, and Green Girl. And let's see the next slide. So some of the some of the goals of this design project was to create a pedestrian network that is accessible to all ages and abilities and connects with local business, transit, and economic opportunity. 2, improve currently unimproved streets to maximize green space, improve stormwater management, and minimize green infrastructure costs. And 3, create new park spaces and community gathering spaces to address a lack of these amenities in the community. So why is it important? Why did I list these list of goals, and also why was it important that we had this design team that were local and that understood issues? I think that when we think about the Jade District work, really the goal is around stabilization and anti-displacement. And we view greening as a key piece of like, how do we create a home and a livable space for people to exist in and exist with each other. And we also view it in terms of not a standalone green issue, but it is an issue of like, how do we create economic opportunity, stabilization, connection, transportation, access, and safety. And so these were all kind of reflected throughout the entire process and expressed by the community. And we had an amazing team of folks that designed them into these designs that you'll see. I promise there's a lot of pictures, so I think they speak louder than my words. So what we did was that we had a 3-day charrette in the summer of 2017, roughly around 100 attendees, consisting of a lot of partners that are in this room now, and also community stakeholders, business owners, renters, and also partners as well. We even held in-language workshops in Vietnamese and Cantonese to do our best to encompass and create access for what does the neighborhood and the community want to see happen. Ooh, I'm running low on time. So I will then kind of just breeze through these next designs. I know there's a digital copy that Katie will make available to committee members as well. So we had 3 focus areas. I'll breeze through their before-after photos. There are kind of some highlights from the report around design elements, and beyond greening, there's also like access and transportation, and bikeways, visibility for small businesses that are largely immigrant and people of color owned. So I'm just gonna breeze through pretty pictures. And then here are some of like our mid and long-term goals. Some of these are robustly like underway with our Jade Greening Collaborative that Chad had mentioned before that came out of the Oregon Solutions Project. And some of these things have been really visible and impactful to our community. For example, our pedestrian bridge reclamation project, where we contracted with the artist, Rodolfo, that did community listening sessions and worked with local youth to create these murals. And then also our Jade District Air Quality Placemaking project that we did with another artist, Daniel Granius, that did community listening sessions and really brought, the goal was around diesel awareness, but we really scaled it to the way that community members can feel connected to that issue, and kind of brought it to like, what is air quality, what generates bad air quality, and what can generate the air quality that we want to see. And so in the top picture, you can see kind of, oh, I can't really see the details, but they're face masks that community members have drawn or written on. And so also to say, keep on the pretty picture. Also to say, you know, we are continue working on, we have the unique ability as a nonprofit and at the intersections of like working with bureaus, working with other organizations, working in partnership with multiple issues to kind of move this work forward and hopefully be able to have community at the center of who's like benefiting and stabilized by the greening efforts. And then Todd can kind of talk a little bit more broadly about like in 2020 and beyond, like what Apano is gearing up for.
Sure. I guess going back to I just want to be clear on the before pictures. That could actually say current. So if you go to the design, all those design charrettes, that's pretty much what it looks like now. And so I think to answer the question of, how can PCEF help move this work forward? First, I would just echo everything that our friends at both mentioned around multi-year grants, general operating, all of those common nonprofit struggles that take us away from the work that we really feel is mission oriented and being able to focus all of our work in that most authentic way. So that being said, some of the specific things, affordable commercial development is something that's very much on our radar. Some of the things that if we could see something like the Portland Mercado in our neighborhood, which would include green infrastructure and a sustainable way of housing entrepreneurs and community gatherings. That's something that we're thinking about. Energy efficiency for the Jade District. One of our other colleagues, Jay Raj, wrote an RFP to the Portland State University Masters of Urban and Regional Planning students to see if we could get students to help us design a proposal for energy efficiency in the Jade District. You've seen some of the EPA designs that we need help. And then solar workforce development. Those are conversations that we've been having with partners. I think I saw Jenny from Energy Trust of Oregon. Many folks that are working in this area that we're not really sure how that would look with our work. And so thinking about how we can spend some time and resources and energy in building that program out would be wonderful. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for coming and sharing your experience and your expertise and your insights. We are at time right now, but I'd like to ask committee members if we can make a slight modification to the agenda and maybe allow for about 10 minutes of questions and right now so that you have the opportunity since these folks are here. And then I'll just ask for any closing comments, and then we can kind of close the meeting and spend whatever time is remaining in the work session. Does that work for everybody? Okay. So does anybody have any questions? It's always going to be Robin. Robin.
Someone else can ask a question.
No.
Thank you very much. This is very informative and enlightening. The word green was used a lot in the last hour presentations, and that's great work. It's needed, has great benefits. And I guess this question might be more of a question for staff, and that is, not all green is created equal from a clean energy or from a carbon offset perspective. And just kind of curious what the scope we should be focusing in on. Like, planting trees, you can make a strong correlation that trees can, reduce carbon and, have a lot of benefits that probably relate directly to our funds. But, wastewater management, I don't know. I'm not an expert, but I'm just kind of curious, what's the scope of the legislation or and where do we draw the line? You guys are pointing at each other.
This is Sam Barrasso for the record. When we come back to the legislation, it ultimately comes back to in service of the climate action plan and making sure the climate action plan is, the city's climate action plan and county's climate action plan is implemented in a way that addresses historically underserved communities. So I always bring it back to thinking about the carbon benefits as well as the community benefits and holding those two up. Those projects, I think, the stormwater projects have greenhouse gas emissions benefits, and it'll be about quantifying and bringing more and speaking to how does that compare in terms of some of those benefits. So I think you're going to always need to hold those, and I would argue that all these projects oftentimes have co-benefits. and we're going to be working on putting together a criteria and a framework for you all to evaluate those.
Okay.
Is there anyone on the panel who wanted to comment on that?
I think that was a great question, Robin. Just briefly, I'd say my perspective is we have such a tough, high hill ahead of us in terms of equity and climate crisis that I would hope you'd look at all the aspects that may be germane to what the funding can be used for and think broadly. So things that may seem like they're not as directly relevant, maybe it's worth the time to look and see if they really can be.
Ranfis?
Yeah, I guess a question for staff. Sorry, first I want to thank all the panelists who've done a presentation. I think just a question for like staff. I think we've had a few presentations from a few agencies like Energy Trust, and really thankful for like Parks and Rec and BES to be here. I think given that we're trying to address sort of the greenhouse gas component and tackle some of these definitions, as well as the workforce and contracting piece, like it would be great to ask future agencies or parties that will be joining us to sort of share some of the challenges or opportunities around workforce, especially workforce diversity, just knowing that that's just a long-standing disparity. So I think that's just one request moving forward. And I think another request would be, I think I really value hearing groups like VOS and Apano just sort of sharing some of their work. I think really want to hear some of the challenges, like just hearing like for VOS, like they're working to try to get a permanent site in their building, just understanding what are those current challenges. And I think for Apano, just hearing about just everything that you've all presented, I'm like, that's amazing. And that's just the planning phase. It's just for me, it seems like, this might actually segue to my next question, but I think I really want to like find opportunities to hear from community groups some of those challenges and opportunities and working with some of these institutions to make these projects possible. And I think, I'm thinking about other projects like Hacienda was mentioned. I think I used to live in the Cully neighborhood, so the Cully Park project comes to mind, but I just really want to hear from community groups just the challenges just to move these projects forward, working with agencies and financial institutions, contractors. So those are, I think, things I think might be beneficial for this group, given how the grant making program is structured. I think I've spoken a lot with those requests, but I think, for Pano, if I can ask them a question, I'd really like to hear some of like lessons learned or things to know that you think would be beneficial for community to even get to this phase on this case study.
I think in terms of challenges of working with our bureau partners, I think we always have somewhat of a challenge, like I think this is just an institutional challenge, like always of like what the folks in the same bureau knowing what other folks are working on. I know this is oftentimes my experience is folks will be working on projects within like, let's say like 2 miles of each other, but I'll ask them about how it relates to another project, and it's kind of like, well, that's not really my work. It's something, you should talk to so-and-so. And I think, I don't know how you solve that. I think one of the benefits of the Oregon Solutions process, I think, was having all of the bureaus in the same room, pulling towards an agreed upon goal. So that was, and I think that really led to some amazing work that you've seen. I think the other challenge that, and I don't know, maybe if you want to speak to this a little bit, but like I sensed oftentimes like once deliverables and like commitments are made or are like either accomplished or not accomplished, but it's like you sort of meet, everybody makes their commitments, everybody works on it for a set period of time, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. After that period's done, it's kind of like, okay, now what? Like how do you, so the challenge is like sort of how do you sustain that momentum and continue to have people engaged and coming up with new ideas and commitments of how to keep that momentum going. I don't know if that's a fair way of.
No, totally. I just have like one thing to add is like kind of linking to the great opportunity of PCEF. Something we're constantly thinking about in community development is like community control and also like land acquisition. So I think that has been like a major barrier in us like understanding that we're a parks deficient area, and we definitely want to make sure that and we've like worked with parks and they've been really open and awesome about stating like what's the resourcing and what's the process look like of developing a park. I think the trouble that we've had is around like relationally, how do we mobilize like landowners, but then also like how do we have enough allocation to acquire a piece of land so that it can be designed and invested in by community and organizations like such as Apano helping facilitate that process. And so I think that's like a really great opportunity with PCEF and the amount of funding that's going through to create that process where community-based orgs and community development can happen in this very central way.
Thank you. Faith?
Well, thank you all. That was great information to have. One question that came up, and it came up during your presentation, Apano, around anti-displacement. And I think I heard you say that this at its base was an anti-displacement conversation. And one, I want to hear more about what you meant by that. And also what came up in community conversations about how improvements were not going to lead to further displacement. So what you've built into the process for that.
So I wish I could say that we have the answer and that it will like be a great thing that the committee can implement into future projects. I think at the core, it's like for us, we're working at the crux of not only greening, but of like housing and business stabilization as well. So I think we recently have a huge win as Apano doing our mixed use development of affordable housing and our community space, Orchards of 82nd. And I think that we have approached and community have also like affirmed that mixed use of space. For example, let me see if I can find a visual. Thank you for letting us leave that up. So if folks can, for those who can see on the slide, like there's kind of some buildings in the background. This idea of creating multi-uses or spaces that serve multiple challenges that the neighborhood would face. So the idea around this was having affordable housing built on this site along with the park development so that there would be increased safety of like eyes on the street or eyes on the road, in addition to creating more affordable housing opportunity. In addition to kind of here, when we're designing like connectivity and visibility, we're thinking about how do we improve access and visibility of small businesses to kind of help the businesses that are already here, in addition to conversations that are taking place. I think maybe Todd maybe can speak a little bit more, but we also do some we also do work with Prosper Portland around small business advising, both for entrepreneurs and also helping local small businesses. And so it's like, how do we create affordable spaces that people can choose to either develop their business and or like stay in their business in those policies that are implemented along with greening design. And I think that's extremely vital as we continue to butt up against this issue of like green zoning, of like greening displacing people and them not being able to experience the benefits of what that is.
Thank you. Michael?
So as always, we come with a hard question. I sometimes worry. So you were talking about things like taking care of trees on public space and being able to pay for arborists to come in and care for those things in public spaces. And I sometimes I worry that, you know, like I feel I could be wrong, but arborists seem to be a very homogenous group of people that come out of the Forest Service. Black, Latino, indigenous homeownership is below 30%. Most are in East County, out where I kind of reside. I'm guessing that our tree canopy is even less, right? So I often worry that funds that get allocated for things like that are just going to move to the West Hills and be used to pay white male arborists to cut trees where there is canopy, because that's where the work is. So I always worry about funds being allocated and then kind of moved to the places where they shouldn't be. And what would be some of the things that you could do to mitigate those effects?
Yeah, you're right. That's the way that has gone in not just forestry, but the natural resource fields, urban forestry among those. What we've been doing, and you'll see that in some of the slides, that one that shows the disparity across the different sides of the river and how east side of the Willamette is far underserved by trees relative to the west side. And so what we've literally done, and growing a more equitable urban forest is a good example. You can literally look at that through the link and see the plan for how to change that paradigm, is really focusing our efforts, our resources, all of our outreach, education, planting programs in those low canopy, low income areas, which are almost all on the east side and mostly on the outer east side. So for example, right now we're really focused on the Hazelwood community, which is one of those truly low canopy, low income areas compared to the average across the city. So we did our Arbor Day events there. We've been planting up the parks there. We did a free yard tree giveaway, 750 trees this past fall, the great majority of which went to that area and the Jade District. We've been working with Apano on the Jade Greening Project for a while. So probably, 10, 15 years ago, before my time, I don't think there was that lens of where is that resource going as opposed to where is it most needed. That's changed a lot. So, and if you have any questions, specifics about it, or you want data, feel free to reach out. We'll help you with it. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
All right, Shanice?
Thank you for providing this good insight on work that's happening, on needs that are present and challenges that y'all face. I'm sitting with this as we transition to thinking about grant criteria in that process. In this conversation about the kinds of grants, design grants, for example, I guess I want to double tap on the conversation about working and centering community organizations, community-powered efforts in this way that connects with institutions. And so I don't know if folks have thought about or have interacted with a community benefit agreement, for example, is something that's coming to mind, and in maybe some context it might not make sense. And so I'm just curious about in various aspects what this looks like to really drive the significant level of funds that both there is interest from institutions, right, and that are thinking about equity work, but ultimately I think the true solutions are led, right, with folks on the front line. So I'm just kind of grappling with the structural grant making, how do we think about the forms of grants that are most helpful with where folks are at, and this piece around maybe a community benefit agreement. I don't know. I'd like to think about that in our discussions moving forward. But.
Thank you, Shanice. Unless there are any other quick questions, I think that we're going to thank our guests for coming. And I'm going to ask committee members if you have any closing comments.
Oh, I just kind of wanted to expand on that, the challenge of working with bureaus. And I think I've mentioned this to leadership as well, in terms of it's about having a comprehensive approach to addressing these issues and problems. We rag on Prosper Portland about not investing in affordable housing, but I think it needs to be a two-way street, right? We want Prosper Portland, this is just an example, not to call them out in any specific way, but to be as invested in the success of green infrastructure and housing and transportation as transportation is invested in economic prosperity and solving, these equitable challenges of equity. So that's kind of what I mean when I'm saying like it can sometimes be challenging. But yeah, so we want to have that holistic approach to how we address these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, with that, I think we're going to close this meeting. June wants me to remind people that there are comment cards in the back of the room there. If you want to leave one and stick it in the envelope, we do take all the comments seriously and consider them. And if it's a comment directly for committee members, we share it with them. With the last part of our, in the last 20 minutes, we're going to go into a work session. Members of the public, you are welcome to stay, but we are not going to be using the microphones, and we're not going to be recording this part of the meeting. All right, thank you.